Hello, we welcome you to the program today. If you would, please turn in your Bibles to Psalm 119. We'll be studying verses 145 to 160. Beginning with the first of these two sets that we'll be studying today, the first beginning with the letter Kof in the Hebrew alphabet, the 19th letter, particularly verses 145 to 152. Verse 145, I cry out with my whole heart. Hear me, O Lord. I will keep your statutes. The psalmist cried out to the Lord in prayer. He entreated the Lord, hear me, O Lord. According to the following verse, his earnest request was this, save me. See that in verse 146. According to the following verse, we see this request, save me. The reason for this wholehearted prayer was that the Lord hear him and save him so that he could keep or obey the statutes of the Lord. He was not bargaining or making a deal. If the Lord heard his earnest cries for salvation, he had determined to keep his statutes. In Psalm 119 and verse 58, I entreated your favor with my whole heart. Be merciful to me according to your word. And so that passage helps with our understanding of verse 145. The psalmist's prayer was offered with his whole heart. And so his prayer was wholehearted, with all my heart, we might say. This suggests his sincerity and earnest devotion to the Lord. And so there was no hypocrisy or pretense with the psalmist. He cried out with all of his heart to the Lord, to hear him with favor, so that he could continue to keep the statutes of the Lord. Verse 146, I cry out to you, save me, and I will keep your testimonies. And so he repeated his cry to the Lord. He prayed with his whole heart, as we see in verse 145. His prayer, save me, and I will keep your testimonies. As many times earlier, testimonies is used interchangeably with statutes, as we see here in this passage, verse 145. He faced danger from the wicked, as we see in verse 150. 147, I rise before the dawning of the morning and cry for help. I hope in your word. And so he prayed to the Lord before the dawning of morning. Other versions read before dawn. And so the idea here is that he prayed before or in anticipation of the morning, before morning became light with the rising of the sun. And so he cried out to the Lord for help. He prayed, hear me. And he prayed, save me, in verses 145 and 146. He prayed with hope in the word of God. This was the promise of the Lord. The term before in verse 147 is the same term rendered awake in 148. The idea that he anticipated the dawning of the morning. His eyes anticipated the night watches, or came before them. And so before each of the night watches, we see that he was ready to praise the Lord, to study his statutes, to keep his testimonies. Verse 148, my eyes are awake through the night watches, that I may meditate on your word. And so he describes how he was often awake through the night, meditating on the word of the Lord. My eyes are awake through the night watches, he said. His eyes were awake or before the night watches occurred. And as he wrote earlier in 147, I rise before the dawning of the morning. A little background information that might help us in understanding the passage. The Jews, as we see here in in the Hebrew scriptures divided the night into 3 watches. And these 3 watches included the first, the second, and the third watches. The first watch, or the beginning, such as in Lamentation 2 and verse 19. The second watch, or the middle, in Judges 7 and 19, we see an example. And the third, or the morning watch, as we see examples in Exodus 14:24 and 1 Samuel 11 and verse 11. And so in the scriptures, we read how they divided the night into these 3 watches. So when we read the passage here in verse 48, 148, my eyes are awake through the night watches, that I may meditate on your word. And so whether it was the first, second, or third watch of the night, we see he anticipated. His eyes were awake. They were before each of these watches. So at each of these times, we see that he was ready. He was ready to meditate on the word of the Lord. In Psalm 63 and verse 6, David wrote, when I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. So David, too, as we see from Psalm 63 and 6, he remembered the Lord even as he was in bed at night. And he meditated, or he contemplated the Lord and his word during those night watches, those watches of the night before morning. Verse 149, we saw the great attention that he gave to meditating or contemplating, thinking upon the word of the Lord. And now in verse 149, he said, hear my voice according to your loving kindness. O Lord, revive me according to your justice. So he prayed to the Lord. He asked the Lord to hear his prayer according to his loving kindness. And so he trusted in the love, he trusted in the mercy, and he trusted in the kindness of the Lord. He knew who he prayed to. He also called upon the justice or the judgment of the Lord. In this psalm, the term justice is often translated judgments, such as in Psalm 119 and 156. His prayer was for the Lord to revive him, the idea of giving him life, renewing his life, giving him strength. And so he prayed for the Lord to revive him. Psalm 119 and 156, great are your tender mercies, O Lord. Revive me according to your judgments. And so we see justice or judgments as found in those passages. In verse 150, he said, they draw near who follow after wickedness. They are far from your law. They draw near who follow after wickedness. Another version reads, who persecute me with an evil purpose. And so as he prayed earlier, Lord, save me, in verse 146. Who were those people who drew near with an evil purpose, or who followed after wickedness? Who were those wicked people with wicked plans and schemes? Well, he describes them in various ways as his enemies, and those who would make a lie against him, those who would persecute him, those who afflicted him. His enemies, he said, were far from the law of the Lord. They did not follow the law. And while he followed after the law, they did not. They followed wickedness. Verse 151, you are near, O Lord, and all your commandments are truth. And so while his enemies were near him, as they persecuted him, they pursued him to afflict him, he said, yet the Lord is near, and he trusted in the Lord. He counted all the commandments of the Lord as truth. And so this helps us to understand the psalmist and his feelings towards those who would turn from the Lord and pervert his word, who would commit wickedness and transgression. In verse 152, he said, concerning your testimonies, I have known of old that you have founded them forever. And so long ago, he knew that the Lord founded or established his testimonies forever. They will always be true. And so this comforted the psalmist. In Psalm 119 and verse 52, I remembered your judgments of old, O Lord, and have comforted myself. And so when he remembered the judgments of the Lord from long ago, we see that this remembrance of the judgments of the Lord gave him comfort. Here in verse 152, those testimonies of the Lord from a long time ago, which the Lord founded to be forever, gave him comfort. Well, that's the end of the 19th set. So that brings us to the 20th set. And in this acrostic, Hebrew acrostic, we see that the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, of 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, are for each of these 22 sets. And so for the 20th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, we see the letter Resh. And so the idea here is found in verses 153 to 160 of his love for God and for his word, as we see through the rest of these sets of this great Hebrew acrostic of Psalm 119. So verse 153, he said, consider my affliction and deliver me, for I do not forget your law. The psalmist asked the Lord, consider my affliction. Another version reads, look on my affliction, or look upon my affliction, or look upon my suffering. And so it's as though he's asking, see, Lord, my suffering. See, Lord, and have mercy on me. Save me. Certainly he knew that the Lord was aware of his situation, his affliction. And we see here that he asked the Lord to consider, to see his affliction, to see him with loving kindness and with justice, which he knew characterized the Lord, even as the psalmist delighted to keep his law. And so with these things in mind, consider my affliction and deliver me. I do not forget your law. There were others who did, but the psalmist said that he did not forget the law of the Lord. In Psalm 119 and 92, unless your law had been my delight, I would then have perished in my affliction. And so we see the great strength that the law of the Lord gave to the psalmist to persevere, to endure the affliction that he faced. Unless your law had been my delight, he delighted in the law of the Lord, I would have then perished in my affliction. Verse 154, plead my cause and redeem me. Revive me according to your word. Earlier, he asked the Lord to consider my affliction in verse 153. Now he calls upon the Lord to plead his cause or his case as his advocate. And that's what an advocate does. An advocate pleads one's cause. In this case, he's calling for the Lord, beseeching him to be his advocate, plead my cause. So take up the case, consider my affliction, and plead my cause. Having considered his affliction, he felt sure that the Lord would defend him and redeem him. For example, in Psalm 35 and verse 1, plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive against me. Fight against those who fight against me. And in Psalm 72 and verse 14, he will redeem their life from oppression and violence, and precious shall be their blood in his sight. And so he asked the Lord here in verse 154, to revive him. Revive me according to your word. Another version reads, for revive, give me life. The idea here is strengthen me according to your word, or according to the word of your promise. He trusted in the word. He trusted in the promises of the Lord. In Psalm 119 and 25, he said, my soul clings to the dust. Revive me according to your word. In verse 155, salvation is far from the wicked, for they do not seek your statutes. And so he said the wicked are far from salvation, or far from receiving salvation. Why? For the wicked do not seek the statutes of the Lord. And it's the statutes of the Lord that bring salvation. Earlier, the terms salvation and mercies are used interchangeably. For example, in Psalm 119 and 41, we see the term salvation, and then in the second stanza, mercies of the Lord. And so the salvation of the Lord, the mercies of the Lord. And so he hoped for, he longed for the salvation or the mercies of the Lord, that the Lord would show him tender mercies. Verse 156, great are your tender mercies, O Lord. Revive me according to your judgments. So he praised the tender mercies of the Lord as great. Great can mean at least a couple different things. It may refer to the superiority of something, or it may refer to the number of something. For example, in this case, great may describe the greatness or the superiority of the mercies of the Lord. His mercies are like no other. He lovingly and caringly shows mercy and compassion to the faithful. The same term may be translated also as many, and so great or many, as we see in the next verse, 157. In such a case, the tender mercies of the Lord are said to be abundant or many. And there are many or numerous examples of the mercies of the Lord. As the tender mercies of the Lord are great, whether we're talking about magnitude, of magnificence, of superiority, or we're talking about many or number, the number being great itself. And so as these tender mercies of the Lord are great, he asked the Lord to revive him, to strengthen him, and give him life according to his judgments, or as justice would require. Be just. And so the just God to be just. He calls upon his justice, but also upon his tender mercies. There's a verse in this great psalm, Psalm 119, verse 77, let your tender mercies come to me that I may live, for your law is my delight. Verse 157, many are my persecutors and my enemies, yet I do not turn from your testimonies. Here's that word translated many. In the previous verse, great. And so great are the tender mercies of the Lord. And in this case, many, referring to the number of his persecutors and enemies. Many are my persecutors and enemies, yet I do not turn from your testimonies. And so he described the number of the persecutors and his enemies as being many or numerous. There are many wicked who are causing him affliction, and he calls upon the tender mercies of the Lord, which are great, as we saw in verse 156. Despite the affliction caused by his enemies, he resolved to not turn away in distrust from the testimonies of the Lord. And so even though his enemies were many, the tender mercies of the Lord are great. And so he would not turn away from the testimonies of the Lord. The Lord is faithful, and he resolved to be faithful, unlike some. as his enemies and persecutors. So despite the affliction caused by his enemies, he would not turn away from the Lord. Verse 158, he said, I see the treacherous and am disgusted because they do not keep your word. And so he witnessed people who he said were treacherous. This describes those with a readiness to betray trust or confidence. This Hebrew term is frequently translated in the book of Proverbs as unfaithful, on one occasion as faithless. And so the treacherous or the unfaithful, as we see it frequently translated. When we see treacherous, we think of someone who has a readiness, a tendency to betray others and the trust or the confidence that they may have in another. For example, in Proverbs 11 and verse 3, unfaithful, he said, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the perversity of the unfaithful will destroy them. The unfaithful, or as we see here, the treacherous. He contrasts people with integrity with people with perversity. He contrasts the upright with the unfaithful or treacherous. In Proverbs 11 and 6, the righteousness of the upright will deliver them, but the unfaithful will be caught by their lust. And so here he contrasts righteousness with the unfaithfulness of the unfaithful. Proverbs 13:15, good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. And so here he contrasts someone with good understanding with the way of the unfaithful, or the way of the transgressor, the way of the treacherous. He said that their way is a hard way. Proverbs 22 and 12, the eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, but he overthrows the words of the faithless. Here we see a contrast between the Lord, who preserves knowledge, with the faithless or the unfaithful, the treacherous, who he overthrows. And finally, in Proverbs 25 and 19, confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint. You can't count on a bad tooth or a foot out of joint. Bad tooth to chew or a foot out of joint to walk. One cannot put confidence in an unfaithful man, a treacherous man. And as we looked earlier, by definition, treacherous man is one with a readiness to betray trust or confidence. Confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble. He cannot be trusted. He cannot be depended on to keep his loyalties, to keep his promises. However, the Lord can be trusted. And the psalmist was resolved to be faithful himself. He looks at his enemies and persecutors as being unfaithful to the way of the Lord, to the word of the Lord. This disgusted him. This caused him grief, grieved him. And so he loathed, he despised the treachery of the unfaithful, the faithless, while he himself loved and was loyal to the word of the Lord. In Psalm 119 and 53, he said, indignation has taken hold of me because of the wicked who forsake your law. So there we see his indignation, or his righteous indignation over the wickedness of the wicked who were forsaking the law of the Lord. And in Psalm 119 and 136, rivers of water run down from my eyes because men do not keep your law. So there we see his sorrow, his lamentation, how he shed tears when he thought of how there were those people who would not keep the law of the Lord, who rebelled against him. And there was also the feelings of indignation, of anger over those wicked who would forsake willingly his law. And so those are a couple related passages to what we see here in this verse in 158. He saw the treacherous, he was disgusted. Why? Because they do not keep the word of the Lord. In verse 159, he said this, consider how I love your precepts. Revive me, O Lord, according to your loving kindness. And so here in 159, we see how he loved the precepts of the Lord. Now that's contrasted with the treacherous who did not keep his word. That's contrasted with the persecutors and enemies who turned from the testimonies of the Lord. But we see here in verse 159 that he loved the precepts of God, and so he asked God to see or to consider how he loves his precepts. He said, revive me. And so he asked again for the Lord to revive him. Such a merciful act would be in accordance with the loving kindness of the Lord, who is steadfast in his love to the faithful. Verse 160, and this is the last verse of this set, this 20th set, and also of our lesson today. The entirety of your word is truth, and every one of your righteous judgments endures forever. The entirety of your word, the entirety of the word of the Lord is truth. Here we see the great confidence that he placed in God and in his word and in his promises. This includes every one of the righteous judgments of the Lord, which he says will endure forever. The word of the Lord is truth from the beginning and will endure to the end forever. This term, translated entirety in this version, is a word often rendered as head in the book of Psalms. And by head, we have reference to what is chief, or what is the beginning, the top of something. For example, the word is truth from the very top or from the very beginning. And in this text, it may refer to the entirety or the sum of something. And so one version reads, the sum of your word is truth. The sum or the entirety of your word is truth. And so if we look at it, literally the idea of the head of your word, the beginning, the very top of it is the truth. And so from beginning to end, and it will endure forever. The great confidence that the psalmist had in the word of the Lord. Great lessons for us to learn today of faithfulness to God and great confidence in his word. We hope that the lesson has been helpful as we're studying verse by verse through Psalm 119. Lord willing, we'll continue our study next time. We thank you for the opportunity to speak on this subject.